Hi everybody, in this video I want to talk you through the types of forces that we'll be dealing with in this class. So first off, what is a force? Intuitively, I want you to think of it as like a push or pull. And a little bit more precisely, there's always going to be two objects interacting. And the way that they interact is through this force. There's always going to be something that's exerting the force and something that's feeling the force. So right now, like I'm holding this football, I'm exerting force on the football. When I let it go, the earth pulls down the football. There's two objects. There's the earth exerting the force, and then there's the football feeling the force. Forces, interactions. And in our discussion so far, I've tried to get you to think in terms of like what's causing it, because that's really the important thing. But then when you start to look at some of the interactions, you can start to group them. And that's what I want to talk about right now. So, and before I do that, I should also give you that forces, we can sort of measure them. The unit that we use is newtons. You can have some sort of scale. You can think of it as sort of a spring that the greater the force that I apply, the more it stretches. So that's like one way to create some kind of force scale. The unit that we use is a newton, and a newton is roughly the force you feel from an apple, something that's about 100 grams. That's about 1 newton. Our own body weight, the force that we're applying on the ground, that is on the order of like 500 to 1,000 newtons. So just a little bit of a reference. Okay, so types of force. The one that we've been working with so far, it's what's pulling this football down towards the center. It is gravity. And we give it the symbol F sub g. That's what I'll be using in this class. F sub g, big G, little g, doesn't matter. The direction is towards the center of the planet. So in this case, Earth. If you're talking about the moon, if you're on the moon, it would be towards the center of the moon. Also keep in mind, like the sun and the other planets, they also exert gravity. So we're going to keep it kind of open-ended. Do anything else besides just the planets, the moons, the suns, really big objects? Does anything else exert gravity? I'm going to kind of leave it open-ended for now. That's gravity. Next on our list is the force that's keeping me up right now, not falling through the ground. It's the force that is being exerted from my hand onto the football. It's this interaction between surfaces. If you zoom in on surfaces, there are solids made of molecules, and those molecules are linked together. And when you exert a force downwards, those molecules, they still remain in contact, but they have some give to them. So you press down, and those molecules have some give, and they push back. So that pushback force that you feel, that is what's giving rise to this force between surfaces. A visualization I want you to keep in mind. This is Mr. Alani's elephant, a student in my Regents Physics class called Charizard. Let's go with that. So when I put this mass on Charizard's head, you can kind of see like his head compresses down. It's very visible on soft objects, but that compression happens even on my hand. When I put this mass here on my hand compresses. The molecules in my skin are feeling a force downwards. And this also happens when I am standing on the ground. I'm exerting a force downwards. I'm compressing the molecules in the floor. There's some give, and they're pushing back. And that push back, that force from the floor on me is what I'm feeling. And in all these circumstances, the force that is being applied is sort of perpendicular to the surface. So that's why we call it the normal force. It doesn't really make too much sense, but don't sweat it. The labels aren't so important. It is important to kind of think what's causing it, what's the object causing it. So that's the normal force. And the direction is perpendicular to the surface. So another example, if I am pressing this football against the board, there is a force that I'm applying on the football, and it is sort of in that direction, perpendicular to my hand. When the board is feeling the force being pushed in, it's pushing back on the football. That's why it doesn't like accelerate in this direction. there's that pushback from the board onto the football, and that is perpendicular to it. Yeah, like, so when I push toward in this direction, the book pushes back perpendicular to the surface. That's the idea. So something to keep in mind, hey, when the football is kind of pressing at an angle, that force that the book exerts on the football now is also at an angle. So it's always going to be perpendicular to the surface. We'll look at that a little bit more later. Next force. So this is a really important one. It's friction. We don't always ignore it. Surfaces do have friction, and it's important. Sort of what gives rise to friction, if you think about it, that molecular picture again, surfaces are sort of irregular, and when they move past each other, they sort of scrape against each other. That's slowing down that interaction right there, that surfaces locking into each other, preventing them from sliding past each other. That is what's causing friction. So you should think of it kind of, I don't have sandpaper, but add this like sort of rough sponge. Compare this rough surface to a bowling ball. The bowling ball is really smooth, relatively speaking. So that smoothness is what's reducing the friction between the bowling ball and whatever surface. It definitely depends on both surfaces, but it is definitely the smoothness. It's the smoothness that we care about, that's affecting, that's giving rise to this bigger thing. And we're going to be dealing with that in a few ways. I also want to keep in mind, here's an example. So this is another kind of friction, right? It's like what is making the ball move? Right now it's at rest, and it does accelerate. So there is some force acting on it, and it's not the molecules of my hand being squished that's causing the football to move. It's the fact that my hand has some friction to it. It's like the surface and this surface are interlocked a little bit, so that when I move, I'm also able to exert a force on the football, and that would be a force of friction because those surfaces are not sliding past each other. You can think if this was a perfectly frictionless block of ice, what would happen? It would just stay there. I wouldn't be able to exert a force on it. And you can kind of see that effect if you move your hand really quickly away. The friction isn't enough to move it. The object is going to stay in place. Right, so that is friction. Friction. F sub F. And the direction is parallel to the surface. Really, it's anti-parallel. This friction opposes the direction of motion. So I guess I should say it's parallel to the surface and opposes attempted motion. What do I mean by attempted motion? So just going back to the football. I don't like to anthropomorphize, like treat this like a human, but let's pretend that what does the football want to do? It's not moving right now, so by what we've talked about, Newton's first law, things at rest basically tend to stay at rest. And it's only when I exert a force that this thing starts to move. So I'm exerting a force in this direction, and so friction is sort of trying to oppose that. Friction is opposing the attempted motion. Let's see if I can. Give me 1 second. Okay. Voila. Football became a book with a piece of paper on it. This is a little bit easier to understand. So this block, this ream of paper, when I push it, there is a friction on that surface that's like sort of opposing the motion. So that is what friction does. It sort of keeps these surfaces interlocked, and then when I push in this direction, friction opposes that. Push the opposite way, the ream of paper starts to move in this direction, and friction is opposing it. That's that. And let's see, about 2 more forces. So there's the force from like ropes and chains. We call this tension. You have the symbol S sub T. Sometimes you'll see it as just T. And this is in the direction of the rope So when I pull on the chain sort of at an angle, the force is along the string. The string doesn't transfer the force in any other way besides like in the direction of the string. Last but not least, we'll be dealing with springs. Springs are a very important model. I'll say a very important thing. If I were to stretch the spring exerts a force upwards on this little mass. I'll give it the symbol FEL, maybe sometimes FS. FEL for elastic, and FS sometimes for spring. And the direction is also I'll say along the spring. Along the spring. Opposing the stretch for compression. So what do I mean by that? When I exert a force down on the spring pulls up. And if in your ballpoint pen, if you compress the spring down, it's going to push back. So it sort of opposes the change, whether you're compressing it or stretching it. Those are the types of forces that we'll be dealing with mostly. I want to just keep in mind, there are other forces that we're not going to look at right now, like forces between magnets. There's electrostatic force. There's the force from fluids, the buoyant force. There's other categories, but these are the ones that we're going to talk about, the simplest ones. And I want to say, like, why is it useful to categorize them? Because certain forces behave the same, and also sort of the game in physics, classical physics, is some of these forces have equations. We can describe them with numbers very precisely. So I want to say gravity has an equation. We'll talk about that later. The normal force, it really depends on the surfaces. Like right now I'm exerting a normal force. That's not a very well-defined thing. I can put numbers to it, but it's not a nice, neat equation. Friction, there is an equation for friction. Tension, no equation for tension. It's kind of an effect that happens from something else. And springs do behave in a way that we can describe with a nice equation. So those are the types of forces, and it'd be a good exercise to go back to any problems that we've done, any situations we've analyzed and we haven't named the force, and to try to name it just for a little practice. But keep in mind, the most important thing is not the name, but like what's causing it. And sometimes this will kind of clue you into the direction it's acting in, but rely on your intuition a little bit too.